Montano, Part 4. Mid-2281. The hours turned into days and those days turned into weeks, yet Montano remained in captivity. Stuck in the worst place a servant of Caesar could be imprisoned, the pain in his own mind was far worse than the pain received in any battle he'd ever been in. Montano survived the ambush outside Vegas and was escorted through the whirlwind of bullets to the arms of more NCR troopers patrolling the headquarters at McCarran. Brief glimpses during the attack showed that Falco had been left behind, and Montano screamed and screamed into his gag as he was shoved along. He begged in his frenzy for his captors to return with Falco, but none of them did, and his staff senior had been left for the wolves. With no reason to believe he'd ever see Falco again, he wasn't able to be proud of his decanus coming to death, as his frenzy turned even more towards the lack of competence in NCR forces. Montano couldn't believe the nation that prided itself on its treatment of POWs and philosophy of no man left behind would not hold up the principles they stood for, and this made Montano even more vicious and uncooperative. Montano was pushed through the gates of McCarran, past the sentries behind sandbags pointing their weapons at him as patrols stormed past to reinforce their perimeter against the raiders. Into the headquarters of the profligate military he went, his protests revitalized by each soldier in brown he saw. Every bout of vicious struggle continued to be consistently met with successful efforts to subdue him, and up the steps he went to a holding area on the west end of the profligate facility. There he sat, chained to a bench overlooking the large interior of this building and looking up at the giant air vehicle hanging from the ceiling. His escorts had left for further instructions, and Montano unconsciously attempted to break from his shackles on the steel bench as his eyes took in the place. Dozens of NCR soldiers roamed the place, going up and down the stairs, this way and that, patrolling and walking to their prospective assignments. And many took notice of the prisoner still struggling with his restraints, even as the blood started to drip down his wrists. "They actually caught one," said one profligate soldier to his friends as they passed Montano. "That's two," screamed Montano into his mouth gag as he let loose another spree of curse words that again went unheard as the profligates passed him. Then it hit him. Montano looked to the rest of the bench on his right, and he was again reminded that Falco was not there. Montano was all alone now, a complete failure who landed himself in enemy captivity with not even the comfort of a familiar face anymore. The thoughts of his failure began to weigh on him again as the troopers from across the base began to congregate around him like a zoo animal, offering their insults to the legionary before going about their duties. The only solace Montano found in this humiliation was the fact that the crowd offered an excellent means of distracting him from the continuing weight of his failure. The weight continued to crush him ever so slowly, and just when it threatened to consume him due to his inability to adequately respond to the gawkers, he remembered that his death would still happen. It was just on hold, even at this point. Roughly 10 minutes passed when finally a pair of officers approached him and dispersed the crowd of troopers. One of the officers was a woman, and the other was a man, one a lieutenant and the other a captain respectively. Their stop before the prisoner made Montano lower his head as the crowd left for their duties or attempted to spend their respite at one of the gambling machines overlooking the terminal building. Montano sat there horrendously bloodied, bruised, and broken, his hanging head and long, sweaty black hair hanging in front of his face like a mask of its own. The officers did what they could to look past the black, wet hair without getting too close, but could only see a face covered in reopened scars, drenched in blood, dirt, debris, and a face so bruised that Montano didn't even look like a human being. Montano breathed heavily before the officers, feeling their gaze and feeling the blood rush to the sight of so much beating between the night of the battle and the defiance he gave to his captors along the journey. The officers stood there, speaking softly to one another and marveling at the breathing statue of this shackled embodiment of the East. Finally, the officers observed as much of the man as they needed to and began speaking loud enough for the prisoner to overhear. "This one have a name?" asked the male captain. "If Sergeant Barnes is right, that's a negative. Just another nameless slave of that Arizona creep," said the female officer. Montano stayed silent, knowing anything he said would be obstructed by the gag. He could only think and let his rage fester. "What about rank?" asked the captain before adding, "Or what about battallioner, Kentry? Any unit indicators, willingness to cooperate? Anything." The female officer let out a laugh. Willingness to cooperate? Ha! Look at him. Sergeant Barnes said this guy tried to run into the fiend's bullets. The captain nodded to himself as he studied the prisoner before saying, "That didn't answer the questions, Boyd." The female lieutenant, Boyd, said, "Apologies, Captain, but nothing about unit came with this guy." Sergeant Barnes only said that he and his friend were the marks of a prime before they were subdued and stripped. The captain silently nodded once more as he continued looking over the blood-covered statue chained to a bench. The captain briefly wondered where the prisoner's friend was before he remembered overhearing the part where one of them was killed or left for the fiends. After a moment, Lieutenant Boyd asked, "Want me to see if I can pry his name or proper rank out of him?" The captain looked at Boyd in confusion for a moment until Boyd added, "I heard from our last captured legionaries that some of these guys don't wear their true ranks in battle anymore. Our new friend here could be a gold mine and we don't even know it." Boyd waited and studied the prisoner as the captain thought to himself. After a few seconds of contemplation, the captain replied, "And you believe that, Boyd?" "Sir?" asked Boyd before the captain said, "You can't believe one word of these creeps." He paused before approaching the lower officer diplomatically. "I don't mean to diminish your tasks, but I can almost assure you that whatever you've managed to get out of any previous captives has been a lie. I mean, just look at this man." Boyd and the captain looked over Montano once more, who still hadn't moved. This man wanted to die in battle. He's going to do anything he can to see that he dies in captivity. Believe me, I know plenty of boys in the Rangers who can vouch for the nature of these merciless sacks of garbage. Boyd looked at the captain and the prisoner, then the superior added, "Even if you get anything out of these guys, it's almost a certainty that it'll only be a lie. If you ask me, the best thing to do with this guy is give him what he wants and put a bullet in his brain. Anything else will just be a waste of my time and yours." "Yes," thought Montano as his head hung unmoving, ready to feel the lieutenant's 9mm against his skull. The bullet never came, and the weapons of both officers remained in their holsters as Boyd said, "I know what you mean, sir. Still, there may be some value in what the last prisoner said. After all, we've never captured a Centurion or anything higher than a prime. That's got me thinking there might be something to it." "That's what they wanted you to think, Boyd," said the captain with a subtle laugh. The captain gestured to the prisoner again. "Just look at him. You think this fucking savage or his friends are smart enough to have learned something from their defeat at the dam? Guys like him will happily get bullet holes in their giant helmets if they get to die for that maniac across the river. I don't know, sir. I feel like we surely would have captured one of their officers or something by now unless there was some bad intel out there." The captain said with another dry chuckle, "All right, Boyd. Feel free to try your best to get something out of this one. Just don't be surprised if he reveals exactly what you're looking to hear. All I'm saying is that he's looking to do as much damage to us as he can before he gets a chance to off himself, so take whatever he says with a grain of salt. And don't worry, we'll manage to get one of their officers one of these days, you mark my words." "Noted, sir," said Lieutenant Boyd before kicking Montano in the boot and saying, "All right, Legion man, get up." Montano refused to stand, and Boyd hesitated before getting too close. The captain noticed this and chuckled as he said, "See what I mean? Defiant to the end. Chipping away at these guys' spirit is my favorite part of the job, Captain," said Boyd as she called over 2 additional troopers to help escort Montano away. The captain watched this before deciding it was time to go. As Montano was unchained and his resistance was tamed by the escorts, the captain said, "Hey, Boyd, I gotta check in with Forlorn Hope today, so I'll see if they reported a dead Centurion after the battle that got us this fella." "Much appreciated, Captain Curtis. We'll see if I can't get anything out of this guy before you hear back," said Boyd to the captain. The captain called Curtis, departed, and Boyd said to Montano as the legionary was escorted to a cell, "Doubt a piece of shit like you is capable of being more than a nameless peon, but let's see what I can get out of you. Come on, boys, cell's over here." Montano was thrown into a cell in the McCarran jail, but was almost immediately isolated to his own room in a desolate supply closet the same day. Stuck in the Camp McCarran military jail, Montano was left in the presence of 3 troopers facing prison time for drug use, as well as a pair of civilians convicted of some other wrongdoing against the NCR military. Normally, Legion prisoners were kept isolated from the rest of the jail population, but space was limited, and Montano's struggle was considered rather tame compared to others. Believing Montano had tired himself out on the march to McCarran, Boyd felt it was all right to leave him in an occupied jail cell, at least until accommodations could be made in one of the supply closets later that day. However, Boyd was mistaken. Not more than 10 minutes after Boyd and the escorts departed, Montano managed to break the neck of one of the imprisoned NCR soldiers with his shackled hands. He was in the process of pummeling the two others, while the two civilians screamed for aid that came in the form of 6 armed troopers. Montano watched his secondary plans of hanging himself with the troopers' clothing disappear when all 3 of the imprisoned soldiers were taken out of the cell for medical treatment and one burial. Montano was then chained to a lone bench in the enclosure, and even his attempts to goad the civilians into beating him to death failed, as they stood in one corner. More worried about the strength of Montano's confines than the slurs he spat at them. Not long later, Montano was escorted to a nearby janitor's closet that was stripped of everything but the floor tiles, chained to a radiator, and left to himself with one guard on the other side of the door. Despite not having access to any lethal tools in his bound state, this was still the moment when Montano decided to act on his plans to die. Montano would never be left unrestrained or have the opportunity to die at his own hands or the actions of others. He knew that any slip in his captor's observation would put an immediate end to any potential plans to take his life, but perhaps they wouldn't notice a slowly fading life. Over the hours and eventual days, Montano would decline to eat and drink. He would step on the trays of slop he was offered and kick over the canteens of water. The jailers who saw this never cared, even as his daily interrogations became less and less reliable as his brain deteriorated with starvation and dehydration. Montano was very belligerent in his defiance to all the questions sent his way by Boyd in his daily interrogations. The officer in charge of the McCarran jail interviewed him constantly, only to her frustration. Even the things Montano did disclose would directly contradict the things he said the previous day. He begged for beatings that never came as he felt his body weaken and weaken, but still his captors stayed their hands, knowing that pain and death was all he wanted. The NCR knew that their humane treatment of this savage servant of Caesar was the worst torture they could inflict upon him, and they noticed this even as he began to deteriorate further. Less than a week after his imprisonment at McCarran, Montano was unable to stand for an interview by the MPs, and his condition was quickly identified when accounts from the jailers were corroborated. Just as Montano found himself sufficiently dehydrated, starving, and knocking on death's door, his body had betrayed him. His inability to stand for one more interrogation sent his jailers into emergency mode, and he was pulled from the path to join the rest of Caesar's fallen when he awoke in a hospital bed, hooked up to an IV and receiving the care he did not want. The military nurse expected her patient to be grateful for her tireless work, but was surprised to hear her patient start hurling threats of rape to her for the noble work. The shackles on her patient's bed made sense, and Montano screamed and pleaded and begged for death once more. This continued for several weeks as Montano stayed at Camp McCarran. Montano fell into an agonizing cycle of non-compliance with his captors, just till he could starve himself to the point of death, before awaking yet again under restorative treatment he did not want. The duelist lost track of time not long after awaking from his first attempt at starvation, but the days bled into weeks, and it is believed that Montano spent roughly 4 months in captivity at McCarran. Locked into the cycle of starving himself and undergoing recovery, his time awake and under interrogation remained a burden for the NCR's warden. Montano had revealed plenty, and none of it was reliable. He had kept true to the assumed notions of that first day, and became only a hindrance to the NCR whenever he wasn't inching towards that slow death. Even his name had gone from Centurion Aurelius to Recruit Gula to Lord Interfector to Centurion Thericos to Decanus Montano to Veteran Sereno and even to Legatus Nardius Maximus. In the end, the NCR had no idea who they had in their captivity, and everything he said about Legion operations was completely obsolete or irrelevant when NCR actually looked into any of it. Yet Montano remained alive. Finally, after many weeks in captivity, after many unsuccessful attempts to take his own life, and after countless useless interrogations, the calendar had turned to late September. and the NCR decided to wash their hands of him. Montano was escorted out of his personal cell one day shortly after his most recent recovery from starvation, under the words that he was to be transferred in order to make room for new prisoners. Montano refused to struggle this time, and walked between two soldiers who chained him to his regular bench on the second floor of the terminal building. He had been chained to this bench many times since arriving at McCarran, due to NCR law demanding prisoners be given time outside their cell for recreation. Although the troopers never unbound Montano to partake in any legitimate recreation, he didn't mind the regular change of scenery or the insults from passing troopers. However, by this point, Montano was no longer the amusing attraction he used to be. Most troopers ignored him, and the usual focus on his coming death was a great way to avoid the thoughts of failure with the change of scenery. This time, and without even thinking about it, Montano's protests were quelled by knowing this transfer could offer another more rapid means of death. As Montano sat quiet and calmly on that bench, he was about 3/4 of the weight he was when he arrived, and his brain was dulled by so many run-ins with death by starvation. So, Montano remained like the statue full of the numb hate that he embodied, the pain of failure laying far in the deepest parts of his mind by knowing his death could come in any number of ways on the march to wherever his transfer was taking him. Just like another piece of old-world furniture in this massive old airport building, Montano watched the soldiers pass on by as his escorts smoked their cigarettes on both sides of the bench. The prisoner briefly wished the troopers would congregate around him like usual for a distraction, but the thought of his coming death kept that pain of failure away, and he took a bit of extra solace in knowing that he had not given his captors anything. At thought of that, Montano gave a tired grin at his loyalty till the end, as he watched more and more troopers pass by, completely ignoring him. This new isolation, even by his captors, still hit him in a way he didn't expect. Especially when he overheard a group of nearby troopers leaning on the second-floor balcony beside some slot machines and talking about the aerial vehicle hanging from the vaulted ceiling. All Montano heard was one of the troopers say to his comrade in the middle, "How you know so much about airplanes, Adler?" The one in the middle, apparently called Adler, replied simply, "I had a book about them growing up. It was the only reading material our family had back at our ranch, so I read the thing too many times. If only we had more practical reading material, I could have filled my head with something useful, haha." The trooper on the right said, "That stuff ain't useless. You should talk to Lieutenant about getting yourself transferred to the air wing. Your real mistake was joining the infantry when you should be working on Bear Force 1 at some cushy station out west with a brain like yours. I ain't smart enough for something like that. Why do you think I joined the infantry?" "Ha ha," said Adler, causing his friends to chuckle as well. The second trooper on the right assured his friend and decided to test him further. "Nonsense. You know enough." "Like?" The trooper pointed up at the aircraft. "What's that glass part called? The round part there where the driver sits?" "That's the canopy, and that's where the pilot sits," said Adler with a hint of embarrassment for such support from his pals. Trooper Adler's friends went on testing his knowledge about obsolete vehicles from a long-dead era, and Adler showed off his expertise. Whether or not he was making up the information he was telling was irrelevant. The man's friends were captured, and Montano tuned out as this went on for a while longer. Montano's attention was only brought back to the conversation when one of the nameless troopers pointed up at the aircraft and asked, "How about that part? The flap thing on the wings?" Adler replied, already growing tired of these tests, "That's called the aileron, and before you ask, it's used to control the roll of the aircraft. Or to help change directions for you simpletons." Montano heard the name of that part and heard the word aileron. Montano hadn't thought about that man since getting captured, and Montano wished it stayed that way. Hearing that name again, or even something so close to it, made the dull feeling of isolation weigh on him even more as he waited on that bench. Montano took another look around the vast terminal building, saw more troopers patrolling or going about their business, and all of them continued to completely ignore him. "How far have I come?" Montano thought as he reflected on everything he'd lived through, everything he fought through, and where he ultimately ended up. Hearing that name again reminded him of every deed he'd done on that glorious path since he first met the man. How his first interaction with the young officer called Aileron was the very moment that he'd been ripped out of the massed ranks of the rest of the Legion. how that very first fight, and what it later offered him mentally, was a supreme purpose. Montano could and would have died just another masked face on a field in some other battle maybe years earlier. But it was because of Aileron that he continued to strive onward. It was because of Aileron and what he wanted to do to the man in one of their fights that kept him moving forward. Striving for more glory and renown far in front of the rest of those masked faces tumbling to the ground with the burst of machine guns from so many enemies. It was because of Aileron and his vicious hatred and respect for the man that he stood out from the ranks and outright refused to return to them when there was honor to be gained for Lord Caesar just waiting to be seized in the smoke of battle. Montano continued to reflect on his life all the way up to the moment he finally had Aileron where he wanted him in their last fight after the death of Graham. Montano had won, and that victory caused him to serve so excellently in the following years of Eastern Reconquest and Western Terror until, upon remembering where he was and feeling the restraints around his wrists, Montano couldn't figure out whether or not his ultimate conclusion about Aileron was one of even more respect or even more hatred. Before Montano could further consider his feelings for his rival, the only conclusion he could come to was one of simple fact: Aileron was still alive. Knowing his rival was still alive and believing his own death was still just a matter of time, Montano could only sit on that bench and hope that Aileron would remember what he achieved, due to their glorious rivalry, and not change the direction of the plane. Montano felt the first words that weren't slurs towards his captors leave his lips when he found himself saying to his rival's spirit from that little bench, "Don't you ever forget me or fail Lord Caesar like I did, Aileron." The cigarette dropped out of the mouth of one of the escorts on his left, shocked at hearing any non-curse words from the prisoner. Before the trooper or his friend could address this fact in the lackadaisical manner characteristic of NCR troopers, both Montano and the guard's attention was turned towards a distant voice shouting. Up the nearby escalator came Lieutenant Boyd at the front of a four-man escort, bringing in a full-on Legion Centurion in the proper armor and plumed helmet. Boyd shouted towards the officer leaning on the distant stretch of the second-floor balcony, "You were right, Captain Curtis. We finally got one. He says his name is Selous, too." All the idle troopers around the terminal turned towards the captured Centurion, again forgetting Montano's existence with the new arrival. The distant Captain Curtis shouted back in a dry tone, "I knew you would." Montano was busy studying the newly captured Centurion being escorted to his old cell, marveling at the stupidity of this Centurion called Selous, who got himself captured in full garb. Montano never heard of this officer and assumed him to be one of the less experienced ones that Caesar brought up from New Mexico or somewhere. And Montano felt he failed in a new way by not being there to address the man's battlefield apparel on this front. Either way, Selous's was too far to study as he disappeared into the cell, and the guards exited along with the officer. Just then, the Captain Curtis shouted across the way, "Suppose you can dispose of the old one, Boyd. The Centurion certainly looks like he'll cooperate." "Here's hoping," said Boyd as she dispersed the escort before adding, "But that's a negative. This one here is getting transferred west." Captain Curtis had maneuvered himself closer to Boyd and Montano, standing roughly 30 yards away and apparently studying Montano from the distance. Montano's face was still horrifically bruised, and the months in captivity created a large beard on his face that covered most of the area not covered in bruises or old scars. The captain stood there for a long moment seemingly trying to identify the captive duelist, but soon gave up. Finally, the captain said to Boyd, "Fine. I still think you should put a bullet in this one. The road's a dangerous place, Captain, but this guy's going west," answered Boyd, and the captain walked off. Montano felt his wrist get unbound, and the protest he offered was minimal as he was more focused on the last look from Captain Curtis. Montano hadn't met with Captain Curtis at any time during his entire captivity, but what little he heard about him was something Montano wondered about on many occasions. After many unsuccessful interrogations, Montano was usually thrown back in his cell by his guards who'd always say something along the lines of, "I see Curtis is still right about you. Should just put a bullet in you and save Boyd the trouble. Lucky you, that's above my pay grade." Montano continued to wonder why that captain was seemingly the only officer in the whole base who wanted to give Montano what he wanted throughout his whole captivity. Not only this, But Montano learned in passing shortly after his arrival at McCarran that the captain did actually follow up with the NCR at Forlorn Hope. The captain had apparently said that there was a centurion amongst the dead of Montano's final battle. Lacking the ability to transport a potentially half-rotten centurion across the Mojave to McCarran, Lieutenant Boyd apparently took the captain's word. The most bewildering thing about this was the fact that Montano and Tubero were both disguised as prime legionaries that night, so Montano didn't quite know what to think. Either way, Montano was no longer of use to the NCR, as evidenced by his impending transfer. However, even up to this moment, the captain was the only one who knew what to do with someone who outlived their usefulness. Montano was then stood up, and 4 other men joined his 2-man escort down the stairs. A few weeks later, Montano was escorted south from the NCR's headquarters at McCarran Airport, leaving the bright city of New Vegas far behind. The trip took many more days than he originally expected. His group regularly had to stop to evade bands of raiders, and even though he wanted to throw himself into their guns, the group of troopers was an experienced bunch, and his restraints prevented him from inciting his death. Slowly they went across the desert as Montano was forcibly shuffled along with his legs and arms bound, linking up with southbound caravans whenever possible and entering into the desert when they were left alone. His arrival at the solar station called Helios 1 was a welcome surprise as he knew the place was in striking range of the Southern Terror Force's raiders. Unfortunately for Montano, his escort was kept well informed on all the activities across the South, and they even stayed at Helios 1 for a few days, until a ranger group from Hoover Dam could arrive and quell the Legion activity across the South. After that, Montano departed once more, and the days bled into each other till he found himself shuffling west between the 6 guns around him. The desert heat offered plenty of chances to dehydrate himself, but once again, he would find himself ripped out of the grip of death by a canteen rushing water down his throat. Still, more days passed, and Montano and his group diverted south down the I-15 from a town called Prim. Up the hill he went towards the colossal statues of 2 men between the mountains and towering over the old I-15. Under the legs of the monument they continued, and Montano fantasized about the day the Legion would burn this monument of Ranger unification to the ground as he officially entered NCR territory proper. The party proceeded south along the 15 for roughly 3 days after passing under the NCR's Ranger Monument at the Mojave border. Along the way, they passed a few large camps where soldiers congregated before moving north to the Mojave. On that 3rd day, Montano had finally reached his destination. Just where the I-15 began going west, Montano was escorted to the last NCR military installation near the Mojave border. Set around an old-world train station, Montano saw the large block at the end of what appeared to be an intact rail line before shuffling through the gates and into the surrounding tent city. Many soldiers patrolled the place, but Montano noticed a majority of the tents were full of supplies and crates. More troopers gawked at him while he continued along, and he ignored the words hurled his way, more focused on the uproar of shouting coming from the west edge of the camp. At last, Montano entered a city of tiny shacks, each one with a barred door, and all set in rows near the train platform. Montano passed by many vacant jail shacks, but the further he went, the louder the shouts became, until he eventually started seeing the men in crimson and black behind the bars shouting at the patrolling jailers and even himself. Many of the captive legionaries noticed their new brother, and assured him that they would kill him as soon as the opportunity was available. Montano appreciated this, and telepathically assured his imprisoned brothers that he'd return the favor if possible. Just as soon as Montano knew that this was going to be his new world for the time being, he was tossed into one of the vacant shacks. The door slammed shut behind him with a lock, and after briefly scanning the place for some means of taking his own life, he concluded that starvation or dehydration remained the only means of accomplishing his goal. As much as Montano wanted to join his fellow captive brothers in their shouting defiance, Montano instead propped himself on the partially torn cot within the cell and sat there silently, hoping the heat would assist in his suicidal endeavors. Still, Montano knew that even if he'd become dehydrated or starved enough, he could see the gaggle of profligate soldiers on the nearby train platform. And all 8 of them wore those devilish Red Cross armbands as they looked over the prison town. There, Montano sat, already getting a head start on his attempt to starve himself despite knowing his inevitable restoration, and all was lost. Of the roughly 100 or so jail shacks he saw on the walk-in, he could guess that around 30 of them were occupied by his brothers, and he was the newest addition. Although 30 was more than he would have ever guessed, as the amount of captured legionaries in this campaign. He wondered how long they had been here, and knew that there would be more coming in before Caesar finally liberated this place and saw to their ends. Montano looked across the path between the cells, and knew by their continued protests that each one of these captured servants of Caesar were still brave souls. Despite his admiration of their ongoing struggle, and despite his new understanding that captivity was sometimes inevitable, the fact remained that they were all still failures to Lord Caesar. The duelist lost track of time very early into his new incarceration, but it is believed that a few more weeks passed at this new jail. Still, just like before, Montano's attempts to die were prevented each and every time, and the same could be said for the other legionaries across the camp. All the while, Montano thought in the solitude, and the feeling of failure he'd been battling since that night in the forlorn hope no man's land had finally consumed him. He would still attempt to die, thanks to that ingrained reflex, but Montano eventually concluded that he was already dead when the full weight of his failure consumed him. So, there Montano sat, completely silent in his jail cell day after day, and his mind was blank as he waited till his next removal from the grip of death. Only a handful of the other jail cells were filled up over the weeks, and the guards making their rounds between the rows changed by the week as the previous ones were pushed further up the line. Many of the new guards indulged in their opportunity to gloat in front of the savage prisoners, and that chorus of defiance continued day after day while Montano remained silent. Eventually, the prisoners across from Montano began to hurl the occasional insult his way for not partaking in the mudslinging. If only I could tell them who I am, thought Montano on many occasions as he continued his silence before his thought was intercepted in its telepathic way. Although Montano was so slim by this point, and the length of his beard and hair made him unrecognizable, many of the legionaries across the path had not lost their ability to receive messages in that way, and understood that Montano's silence was due to some sort of importance in his rank. Montano would hear this message communicated in the loud apologies sent his way after a string of slurs, and he silently pardoned each one as his eyes remained on the wall of his shack. After so long in this new jail, and after being revived countless more times, Montano finally overheard what was going to happen to him and his comrades in captivity. NCR had finally captured enough servants of Caesar to do something with them. There wasn't 100 now, but apparently, the NCR expedited their plans with these Legion prisoners of war when a reporter from the West visited the holding center around 2 weeks earlier. The reporter was supposedly appalled by the conditions of the prison and managed to learn that some of these POWs had been in the same cell for months through the endless series of slurs sent his way. Sitting all day in the heat and only leaving their cells to empty their waste buckets once a week was deemed too inhumane by the reporter. So, after the reporter threatened to release the treatment of Legion captives to the broader NCR public, the military agreed to take action. The day he learned NCR was sending a locomotive to transfer the Legion prisoners to an actual NCR prison was a noteworthy one, since the new group of guards were a loud bunch of young rangers who clearly hadn't seen any action, based on their lack of humility and overwhelming bravado. It was late at night, and Montano had just broken from his usual trance to hear the group of patrolling rangers saying that the train would be at this camp in 2 days. Montano had long since learned how to tune out the perpetual shouting from his comrades, and this made it possible for him to hear the news. Now, Montano had no desire to hear the news, as he was already a day and a half into dehydration after another recent recovery. But the short break from his focus on death allowed him to take notice of the ranger guards. Every now and then, Montano had to fight the urge to drink from the small pool of dirty water in the corner of his cell, and he did so by silently belittling the nature of his captors. His particular disgust for this group of rangers led him to following their actions and growing even angrier at their unearned bravado. Being amidst one of the louder sections of the captive line, Montano's eyes eventually landed on a pair of rangers setting up a radio on a fold-out table. The shouts increased amongst those who could see the radio being set up until they trailed off in their usual way. This happened until the jails on his right began shouting a series of slurs at one of the ranger women Montano couldn't see. Montano didn't think much of this as it had been normal for so long, even as he heard the footsteps getting closer beneath the shouts. A degenerate like you should be bent over a log, whore. I will gut you and skin you alive. Bitches like you are only fit for one thing. May Caesar's wrath burn you alive. All of this was normal, and Montano thought it was the woman he'd seen the past few nights. Again, Montano shrugged this thought out of his mind and went back to staring at the wall until the shouting faded into the background and he caught a glimpse of a presence outside his cell's bars. This silent interruption stole his attention, and he couldn't help himself but look to its source. Just beyond the bars and staring into his cell was the ranger woman he suspected. But why she was standing there was an irritating mystery that needed to be addressed. Before demanding the reason for her presence, he saw the figure of that woman, and his partially dehydrated brain made her appear like Clara in the moonlight. He wanted to ask why Clara was dressed as a profligate ranger, but his mind returned to reality and he saw the ranger still standing there in the ranger civilian regalia, with one hand on what appeared to be a booklet and another on the bars. Why is this fucking child staring at me? Montano thought, as he returned his attention to the walls, still partially thinking about Clara. The ranger woman didn't move, and Montano almost immediately forgot about her presence until he heard something skidding noisily across the dirt. This made Montano's attention return to the woman who had just flipped over a nearby bucket and took her seat on it in front of his bars. Returning to the woman, he couldn't make out much of her in the moonlight other than her youthful figure, braided hair, and darker skin. Montano understood why all his brothers emphasized their brutal sexual desires for this particular profligate, but Montano did not intend to tell her things she already knew, and instead turned back to the wall wondering if Clara had some other long-lost sister. Just as Montano began wondering how well his rival was taking care of his servants and land, the woman began drumming her fingers on the bucket. This irritated Montano immensely, but still, his thoughts remained on Aileron. Before he could think much further about the man he tried hard not to, the woman beyond the bar spoke to him. The rest of you want to rape me, rape then kill me, and one of you wants to kill then rape me, she shuddered. What, you shy? Got nothing to say? That's not Clara's voice, thought Montano vacantly as he turned his head to the ranger woman, more irritated by his removal from focus on the wall than anything. Still, Montano was partially grateful for being rescued from thinking of Aileron and where he likely was now. Montano imagined his rival likely marching on New Vegas by this point, and as glad as he was for a Legion victory at the dam, remembering where he was and who was on the other side of the bars made his inner rage grow. Montano's biggest hatred in the whole world was how the weight of his failure refused to crush him to death. Montano did not mind his captivity when he was able to silently believe he was already dead. This, however, was impossible to believe when the world around him refused to allow him to wither away by showing up with its awful presence. Montano hated any reminder that he was still alive, and his address by someone like this young ranger woman was yet another reminder of his continued existence. He knew that the best course of action was to remain silent or return to the wall, but this one would not take silence as an answer for some unknown reason. Montano sought to finally give the girl what she wanted, if only so it would rid him of her presence. No, Montano finally growled and went to turn his head again before he noticed her about to say something else. Seeking to end this before it began, he added, I have nothing to say to you. He turned his head back to the wall and immediately tried to forget her existence, as well as his own, when the woman instantly proclaimed, and finally, we have a reaction. He saw her throw her hands in the air to celebrate out of the corner of his eye. Go away, go away, go away, Montano thought until she ignored his unspoken directive by saying, You've been so quiet some of the boys thought you might be having second thoughts about the whole Legion thing. What the fuck, thought Montano as the woman went on. They were afraid we'd have to try and rehabilitate you, she snickered. Montano for the life of him couldn't understand what any of those words meant, especially the second thoughts thing about his eternal allegiance. But he unconsciously found himself returning his focus to the ranger and saying, You can't rehabilitate me, girl. He locked eyes with her, studying her abominable face adorned in sarcastic elation as he stewed on the awful sound of her laugh. The more he looked into her face, the more he hated it, and wished once again that she would leave him alone. "I'm perfectly sane," said Montano, feeling his rage at his predicament grow and seeing that terrible smile as a reminder of where he was. His rage increased slowly in the milliseconds after his statement. His war between his desire for solitude and indulging the profligate showing the victor when he spat dryly, "You know who is insane? Your commanders for parading around a piece of meat in front of a bunch of crazed and hungry animals. Unless that was your decision, in which case you must either be too curious for your own good or just plain stupid. And what do you think?" she asked, her smile receding. "Perhaps I'll be polite and go with the former." Montano grinned as he found his eyes wandering up and down her body. Montano wished to return to solitude, but something was growing inside him that felt vaguely familiar. Something that wasn't his primal urges for the Clara lookalike. That feeling of failure overwhelmed every characteristic Montano formerly held, and it would continue to do so in time to come. But the simple words of this profligate sparked something in him that he'd forgotten about since he was consumed by the weight of failure. Montano couldn't quite figure out what this revived feeling was exactly, but the woman went on. "Well then," she continued, reaching behind her and pulling out a knapsack. "Seeing as how you can attempt to be civilized, may I go so far as to task you with representing the other prisoners, mister?" That feeling went to the back of his mind with the new words from the woman. "Gula," Montano answered the question reflexively before demanding, "What exactly do you mean by representing the others?" Montano just then noticed the shouts from his confined brothers hadn't ceased for 1 second, and he thought he understood what the woman was getting at. Before she could answer, Montano tuned his brothers out once again and asked her with blood dripping from his every word, "Perhaps you've mistaken my silence as a willingness to cooperate." The ranger heard this, but still explained as if he hadn't leaped to the point. "Despite your people's lack of cooperation, some of our more liberal-minded members within our organization," she rolled her eyes, "are willing to make your lives in our custody more comfortable in exchange for good behavior and useful information." Montano let the words hang in the air for a long moment until they seeped further into his mind, making him begin softly cackling like a madman. The woman raised an eyebrow at this, and Montano said murderously, between his dehydrated laughs, "That's why you approached me?" He began laughing a bit more before saying, "I thought you were more looks than brains. Good to know I was right. Let me guess. The men over there put you up to this." She glanced behind herself towards the other rangers now tuning their setup radio. Looking back to Montano, the woman ignored his insult and addressed her prior remark. "It's true. You can help us and earn yourself better digs. Might as well, since your grip on the Mojave is getting weaker and weaker. I'd say it's only a matter of time before your emperor fails at the dam, again." Like lightning, Montano rose and slammed his head and fists into the bars. The woman just barely managed to scoot her bucket away in time to avoid his grip, and she wobbled for balance as her heart steadied after skipping such a beat. "Look at me," said Montano, loudly but calmly. The woman raised her head from her new position, and the nearby rangers looked their direction with hands on their holsters. She met his eyes, and Montano felt that vicious spirit yet again, finally understanding that feeling as a renewed fire of unshakably savage loyalty. He slammed his head and fists into the bars 2 more times, and the blood dripped down his forehead as the words, "None of us will ever speak to you, you fucking bitch," spewed out of his mouth. The ranger remained brave in appearance as the prisoner's message solidified itself in her mind. After a long moment, even the other prisoners were silent until the tension eased just enough for the ranger to turn her head. Meeting the eyes of the rangers by the radio, she said to them, "Stand down, fellas." Both of the rangers eased off their holsters while one of them shouted, "All good over there, Natalie?" The ranger called Natalie turned back to Montano and replied to her comrades, "Yeah, we're fine. Just having a chat with the quiet one." Montano continued to stare at her with murder in his eyes, and the ranger collected herself further before addressing the prisoner. "None of you will talk, even for a lost war. Gotcha. Not even for these?" The woman reached into her leather satchel and pulled out some bottles. Montano too collected himself, after mentally ripping her limb from limb nearly 24 times in the short moments after hearing her words. Before he could figure out whether or not this ranger was actually offering him a bribe, she said, "I understand y'all ain't allowed to get a drink on, but I also understand Kaisar forbids you from getting captured and taken alive." Montano barely even processed the fact that she brought up his captivity. If this conversation with the horrible ranger woman did anything for Montano, it made him forget where he was when there was an enemy in front. Not only this, the words and actions of this woman showed him on the subconscious level that he, even now, still had that spark inside that kept him charging into the lines of guns over the years despite the weight of his failure. And look where that has gotten you and your brothers. Of course, I'm also super accommodating and have non-alcoholic options. She went on as she pulled out and snapped the cap off a bottle of 200-year-old warm soda. "I imagine the water we have on hand can be rather stagnant, but what can you do?" She smiled before taking a nice long gulp of the drink. Montano marveled at the fact this woman legitimately thought she was being of any temptation with her abhorrent smile and awful demeanor, even going so far as offering him items that would only tempt the most pathetic of men. No, this woman and her band of inexperienced rangers clearly had no idea who their brothers in the Mojave were fighting. Montano's only reply to all these offers and slew of words was, "You think I crave anything refreshing or intoxicating?" The girl lowered the bottle slowly, and Montano went on, "You all have literally no idea what kind of people you've managed to capture. We don't want comfort or water or alcohol or love or warmth or anything you think you can offer. You want me to cooperate?" He paused, seeing the look on her face twist into something denoting an accomplishment of sorts. Montano grinned at this, seeing the hopeful astonishment in her eyes that merged with his own hope at her seeming cooperation and potential ability to actually listen. At last, Montano spoke the only true words he ever said to any of his captors. "If you want me to cooperate, then you'll assure me that my only reward will be a bullet in my head." The ranger girl remained silent, seeing the seriousness in Montano's eyes. She reflexively reached for her satchel to see if she had his demand in there. But a brief glance back at Montano's eyes said her hand was in the wrong place. She then met the prisoner's eyes once again, and her focus stayed there as her hand hovered to the top of the holster strapped to her leg. Montano's face remained the same in its deadly seriousness, and Montano understood that she was the only profligate who actually heard this message he relayed to Boyd so many times over the weeks of his previous captivity. Finally, the silence ended when she asked the prisoner, "Suppose I could make that promise after getting the go-ahead from the proper channels, but how would I know what you tell me is the truth?" Montano had heard the question he anticipated, and without any hesitation he answered, "You wouldn't." There it was. He saw the woman just about to speak the inevitable follow-up to that answer, but he cut her off. Montano immediately spoke to the very principles a profligate soldier like her held so dear, "Whether or not I tell you the truth, the fact remains that you would be doing your duty by taking my life if you actually believe what your profligate army says it stands for." Montano could see the woman seriously considering what he was saying, but her face also said that she required more clarity. Montano continued, "Killing me, or any of us, is not cruel like your foolish leaders believe. Killing me is just about the most just thing you could do if you and your nation believe in that idea at all." Again, Montano watched the face of the woman take in his words, but he left it at that for the moment, awaiting the next inevitable question from someone who'd actually hear him out. Just as expected, the young ranger woman called Natalie asked, "Well, why should I give you what you want? Tag on your cell says you were just a nameless grunt. How do I know you actually deserve what you want? For all I know, you are just an indoctrinated savage who doesn't know anything." He cut her off right then with the raise of his hand. She stopped and he gestured to the sky, silently telling her to listen. The screaming from the other cells had resumed, the cages to his left and right all getting their structural stability continually tested. Montano and the woman finally locked eyes again, and Montano seriously considered disclosing his true name and rank to the ranger if it meant she'd give him what he wanted. It was highly doubtful that Natalie had ever heard of his story, knew what he'd done for the Legion, or if she would believe his identity revelation at all. However, he had completely captured the ranger's attention, and he knew she was smarter than she looked. Montano said in a tone of calm seriousness he didn't even think he had, "You approached my cell for a reason, girl. You knew that I stand out from the ranks, and you were right to think so. So what's your real name and rank? Interrupted the ranger, but Montano interrupted her in turn, forgiving her interruption by continuing calmly. All I can and all I will tell you is what is true. Make no mistake, I deserve to die. What I have done to the East, for the bull, is not anything you or your nation can ever forgive. I have murdered, I have raped, I have ordered the butchering of so many men, women, children, and enslaved countless others. I have done things for Lord Caesar that would have had me put to death 100 times over if I were a citizen of your country, and all of it was without remorse. He paused, and the woman took all this in. Hearing his words, she began to understand that Montano was in fact a lot more than a lowly prime like his cell's marker indicated. But this realization went uncelebrated as she continued to meet the eyes of this man. At last he concluded, understand that the others here, the ones shouting, even they bear no real distinction from me. The only difference between them and me is that I have been a menace to humanity for a while longer. In the end, the only truth you'll get from us is that we do not deserve any of the mercies or comforts your government insists upon throwing at us. We will not cooperate, and our sparing will only be a burden to you and your nation. What Caesar understands that your nation refuses to is that the useless should be discarded. I've served my use, and now it's time to go. A long silence ensued as the woman went over everything she'd been told. The seconds went on, the screams hadn't stopped, and the young ranger finally asked the prisoner, "So, you want me to give you the death you want even if you give us intel we can't use?" "No," said Montano calmly. "Regardless of what we tell you, the principles of your republic say you have a duty to fulfill, and that duty can only be achieved with our deaths." Again, the two stayed quiet for a long moment. The silence went on and the woman gripped her holster only a little tighter. Montano didn't expect to be killed right then and there, but he saw that his message had been successfully delivered. Suddenly, the silence beneath the incessant shouting was interrupted by the cheer of those male rangers by the radio. The ranger woman turned to the new commotion, and one of the rangers shouted toward Natalie, "Hey Natalie, we got the radio working." She gave them a gesture of acknowledgement and turned back to Montano, who had not moved. She released her grip on the holster and stood from the bucket as she said to Montano, "Well then, Mr. Whoever you are, I agree. I don't think y'all deserve to keep breathing either. I'll run your little suggestion up the chain of command, but don't think you won't be getting on that train when it gets here." She turned to walk away, but Montano remained gripping the bars in his statue-like way. After only a few short steps, the ranger stopped, turned back around, and said to Montano, "But honestly, if what you said is true, perhaps you deserve to be kept alive." The temporarily lifted feeling of failure came slowly back down on top of Montano's being. His inner rage instantly spiked only for its rise to be limited by the pressing of that failure. Montano's brain began to dull yet again, and the fire that was inside was almost extinguished back to where it was before the ranger's arrival. Just then, and before the flame of his driving fire was completely gone, the ranger added, "Get used to living. You'll be in our hands for a long time. But just know your emperor's still a man, and all that loyalty you have for him will become pointless when he's gone, even if he manages to actually take the dam. Help us or hinder us, live or die. You failed your lord. So maybe it's time you put your stock in something else and you won't be such a miserable sack of shit during the rest of your long, long life." At that, the ranger left Montano's presence, and Montano remained standing. Deep down, Montano knew that his emperor was a mortal man. And even though the idea of cooperating with the profligates or abandoning his duty to die never crossed his mind, there was some truth in the ranger's departing words. Montano would continue to live as a captive of the profligates. He did still fail his emperor, but also, there may be somewhere else Montano could put his stock. The embers of that driving fire kept the weight of his supreme failure at bay, and Montano saw these embers take the shape of Alaron. Alaron still lived, and that meant the Legion would still live on in Montano's mind, but what that looked like was entirely up to his rival. The war in the Mojave was still going on, and even though Montano knew that the Legion was still in a position to snatch victory, he also knew that whatever happened at the end of this war would change so much of the world, and perhaps even the Legion. Montano put Alaron up to the task of keeping the Legion on the proper track, perhaps making adjustments when necessary, just like the ailerons of a plane, but not knowing what exactly was coming for the Mojave. Ranger Natalie gathered around the radio with her comrades, and one of them turned up the volume just in time for some sort of announcement after the last song.
A package courier found shot in the head near Good Springs has reportedly regained consciousness and made a full recovery. Now that's a delivery service you can count on.
Aileron, Part 4. Note: I usually try to avoid talking about the main hero or courier in this case, since we know very little canonically about what the courier does during New Vegas. But my descriptions of what the courier does in this chapter will be based primarily on what I believe most players have done in their playthroughs, as well as some input from fellow Writer X commanders. Either way, I'm sure you'll enjoy how the courier factors into the story of Aileron in this period of Legion history. Also, this is the final chapter of the official story, so it's a bit of a long one. Hope y'all enjoy it, and know that there are 2 epilogue chapters after this one, so stand by for those. Months had passed since Aileron became aware of Montano's capture and decided to take Falco under his wing. For a long time, the role and responsibilities of Aileron remained stagnant, but the shocking news of Kaisar's terminal condition in late July brought him a new sense of drive and purpose in his menial position. After gathering all the proper intel that the Praetorian Lucius requested, and after receiving the Frumentari agents charged to his authority, Aileron immediately set about seeking a remedy for Kaisar's vague but dangerous condition. Days and then weeks had gone by as Aileron sent his runners across the east, tracking down anyone not absorbed into the Legion with medical expertise. But none of them held the knowledge required to fix Kaisar's ailment after being brought before Lucius for assessment. The particular nature of Caesar's condition or the direct fix remained unknown to anyone inside or outside the Legion, due to a number of reasons. The East was such a nightmare of tribal warfare before the Legion's conquest that many of the civilized communities hadn't the time or care to treat the specific illnesses of the old world that used to run rampant. With most people unable to live past 50 or 60 in the eastern quagmire of tribalism, the medical knowledge from the territory, even up to the present, was more focused on the treatment of gunshot wounds, radiation sickness, food poisonings, and other conditions that were more relevant to the environments of the East. Time would tell us that the condition affecting the most powerful man in the Southwest was a tumor of the brain, but unfortunately, such a careful surgery required to fix him was unobtainable from the doctors and medicine men of the land, whose most common surgeries only consisted of simple amputations. Not only this, but Kaisar's doctrine for his army held the superiority of the human being over the instruments of old that led to mankind's destruction in 2077. This doctrine created an enormous scarcity of technology across the East. Decades of conquering the land that bombs had so thoroughly cleared still brought about the discovery of many old-world technologies that were said to only cripple the Legion's self-sufficiency, if such instruments even worked at all. As it's been said, drugs, medications, or otherwise were largely outlawed in Legion lands, and countless technologies of old were melted into blades for Legion soldiers over the decades. Where Kaisar saw the past of ancient Rome to be the answer to the problems of the wasteland, the past of the continent before the bombs held the answers to his present condition. The only problem was that much of this past was deemed disgusting by the dictator and eradicated in the bonfires across the East. While Aileron's runners in the East turned up with little, the only assistance he could offer the emperor atop Fortification Hill were the medicines from some of those towns. As it was mentioned above, much of the old world medications to treat various conditions were banned under the Bull banner, but the majority of this procedure was oriented towards the Legion and its soldiers or slaves alone. Just as it was said in previous sections, many of the towns under the Bull operated on their own, and the inhabitants were allowed liberties that weren't available to the soldiers and slaves of Kaisar. That said, there were certain medications that could potentially help Kaisar's condition, even if they didn't outright heal it. The problem with this was the fact that many of those former Allied towns were absorbed into the Legion in the campaigns immediately after the loss at Hoover Dam, and all the items within those towns were erased in the Legion's fire. Still, there were certain townships that withstood the Eastern re-harvest, and so Aileron's runners would only return with medications that would help prolong the dictator's life and not heal him. It was the hope of Aileron, Lucius, and Caesar himself that these medications would extend his life long enough for those doctors of the East to teach themselves how to treat the emperor. Despite this, learning how to perform brain surgeries was a timely endeavor that often took years to perfect, even in the old world. This wasn't to mention the extreme scarcity of such textbooks and documents that explain such operations. So Aileron was able to allow a trickling stream of the appropriate medications into the fort to prolong Caesar's life. But the condition of the dictator continued to steadily worsen very slowly over the weeks and months. While Aileron continued to bring in the proper medications, and while his runners continued to return with incapable doctors or come up short with technological assistance, Aileron, under the advice of Lucius, dispatched his frumentari into the unscoured lands of the West. The frumentari agents in the West seeking Caesar's remedy discovered many doctors around the Mojave likely with the expertise Caesar needed. But the unfortunate problem in this came once more from the NCR and the Legion's reputation on the Nevada side of the river. Many of the people who had worked with the Legion could vouch for the unforgiving and vicious nature of the East's occupiers, but many still spoke about the Legion's fairness in all their dealings. Sadly, the ideas of the Legion's brutal fairness went unheard by the people of the Mojave who'd been subject to NCR authority for decades or lived under the principles of independence for their home region. Needless to say, the people of the Mojave had little good to say about the Legion, and many lived their lives with one eye on their day-to-day and the other on that blood-stained fortress across the river. People all across the desert saw the Legion's actions throughout the South and knew the Legion's terror campaign well. As the people only saw the outcome of Legion actions in the South, they never asked why and continued to see the Legion across the river like the barbarians they were assumed to be. Because of all this, the Legion's reputation in the Mojave was one of tremendous fear and nothing more. By this point, the idea of cooperating with the Legion was something that would remain in the back of the people's minds until the last barricades are broken. The Legion's reputation was only solidified when the terror campaign brought about the destruction of Camp Searchlight and eventually the town of Nipton. Either way, the Legion's reputation in the Mojave was completely shot long before the fall of Searchlight and Nipton, so the frumentarii would find many doctors potentially capable of giving Caesar the needed treatment. But none of them could be trusted to not orchestrate the death of Caesar. At one point around late August of 2281, Aileron was even given more information about the truth of his emperor's past. Aileron had known, like all other high-ranking officers, that Caesar had come to the East as a missionary before he began his Mars-given task of uniting the Southwest under one banner. However, it was in August that Aileron was told by Lucius the name of the organization Lord Caesar was previously affiliated with. When Caesar arrived in the Mojave, he had known that the followers of the Apocalypse had an installation outside the city of New Vegas, and he immediately reached out to them only to learn that his excommunication was still in effect after his last words with them once Flagstaff fell in 2256. With all communications between Lord Caesar and his prior affiliation blocked, Aileron saw this as treachery given the emergency and requested permission from Lucius to abduct the potential doctors under the followers. This request was declined with no reason given as to why, and Aileron was unable to argue with his emperor's decision. So, Aileron dispatched his frumentari agents further across the Mojave for the last resort method of healing the dictator. Accompanying the secret task he received in July, Aileron was also made aware of the technology required to heal the emperor. Although Aileron had never seen an autodoc firsthand, he did receive a photograph of one in the orders from Lucius. As stated previously, the East had long been scavenged, and all his runners sent there could not return with an autodoc or the part described in the report. But Aileron learned that Lord Caesar already had one in his command domicile. With this knowledge, Aileron was given the locations of several military installations and hospitals across the Mojave, but all of them had long since been scrapped as well. At last, the final possibility of Caesar's salvation came to Aileron's attention when he was given the location of the last possible locations for an autodoc system. And those were in the old world vaults that helped ensure mankind's continuation during the nuclear war of 2077. With this, Aileron's runners in the East again turned up empty-handed, with all the vaults across Legion territory having already been sealed or destroyed in the wake of Caesar's expansion. The final resort lay in the Mojave, and Alaron dispatched his frumentarii into the hostile lands to investigate further. The only vaults not sealed or under the control of the less than trustworthy fiends of Outer Vegas were Vaults 22 and Vault 34. The only problem with these vaults was the amount of danger associated with each. The frumentarii agents would return with reports detailing lethal radiation levels and irradiated monsters pouring into the surrounding wasteland through the vault doors. The final reports concluded that the amount of soldiers needed to investigate these vaults' interiors were currently impossible to dispatch. Given the surrounding NCR forces and what expeditions of that size would require by means of experience and manpower. In the end, 2 of the vaults offered the possibility of Caesar's restoration by mechanical doctor, but both would have to wait till the fall of Hoover Dam before they could be investigated. After months of issuing orders to his runners and agents for the secret task, it was mid-October when Alaron was told that he had done all that was required regarding the task. When Alaron asked about Caesar's plans to heal himself, or how he was to act on the months of work, he was told once more that he had done all that was required of him. Still having never met the Emperor firsthand, Alaron remained in the dark about the Lord's condition and was told to leave the matter alone. All Alaron could do by this point was return his focus to the fort's operations and try to forget that his Emperor's demise was just around the corner if it wasn't handled correctly by the ones in charge. In the meantime, all Alaron could do was wait until the day that the orders came for the march on Hoover Dam. By the time late October arrived, Alaron's side work for the tunnels into Hoover Dam was done. The Terra Force's main counter at Searchlight had been rendered uninhabitable. The town of Nipton in the Deep West spread the message of Legion Terra further, and the profligate army at Forlorn Hope continued to be chipped away, and yet the dam had not been taken. The Legion's noose around the NCR's neck was firmly in place, and word had reached Alaron that there was even a plot in the works to assassinate the profligate's dictator called President Kimball. With Alaron settled back in his old role after the excitement around the Emperor's health, Alaron wondered why exactly Caesar was planning an assassination for the enemy's leader, when the Legion remained in the perfect position to show the profligate leader the destruction of his forces at the dam at any moment. Alaron only thought that Caesar was waiting until his legate Lanius returned from his campaigns in the east, but even waiting for this didn't make sense when the forces in the Mojave were ready to take the dam now. None of this even touches the work of the frumentarii who'd been creating covert alliances with factions all across the Vegas region. Between the formalized Great Khan's alliance, the Legion's enemy of my enemy, the Fiends, and numerous infiltrations into the NCR's ranks itself, all the Legion needed was the word, "Go," from Caesar before the Mojave would fall. It was true, the Legion had been ready for months, and this long waiting seemed even more confusing to Alaron when he was made aware of Caesar's condition. Still, even after the matters of the Emperor's health were put on the back burner, Alaron became even more frustrated with his lord's lack of urgency. It appeared that the Emperor was gambling with his own life by continuing this long wait and biding his time that he may not even have while making plans for the Mojave that he may not be around to see if the dam didn't fall. This whole thing frustrated Alaron immensely, even though he would never show it, and Alaron really despised being left in the dark during this campaign that seemingly signaled the inevitable shift in the Legion's future. Although Alaron didn't know it, Caesar intended to tie up several loose ends across the front, and time was the only way to handle that. In doing so, Lord Caesar stared his imminent death in the face, daring it to make a move before he established the proper stage for his triumphant return to his homeland in the West. And knowing death wasn't foolish enough to make a move unless it received the proper sign. Although neither Death, Caesar, Alaron, or anyone else knew it, this sign came in the form of a single person with their own story to tell, a person who was only known by the title Courier. A person who would unmistakably alter the entire course of the Legion's future for decades to come. Whether that person would help the Legion, destroy it, or even perform a strange mix of the two was yet to be seen. Still, all Alaron could do after that legendary individual's arrival was wait for the legate to arrive, and reflect on all he'd been through, knowing that his Emperor was currently gambling with his demise and the outcome of this campaign. Early November 2281. On a cool night in early November 2281, veteran Decanus Falco sat on one of his boats in the middle of Lake Mead as the oarsmen inched them closer to the northern shore. The mist rising off the water was heavier than it had been on other nights, but that still wasn't much, even with the heat of the day still creating a small haze despite the dead of night. The oars splashed lightly in the water, and Falco looked to his right to see the other boat manned by 13 men all sitting quietly. 200 yards from the shore, and Falco whispered to the prime Decanus at the bow, "Lights out." The prime wordlessly acknowledged and snuffed the flame of his lantern. The officer at the bow of the other boat took the cue and turned his lantern off as well, just as the group approached a clearing in the mist. The only sound was the soft splashing of the oars beneath the slow winds across the lake. There in the dark, the 28 legionaries of this raiding party continued on, the haze and mist clearing enough to show the northern shore less than 75 yards away. The twin boats steadily approached the landmark they were after, a simple collection of old-world trailers set by the shoreline that had long been abandoned by the previous inhabitants after the first Legion raids of the campaign. It was true that the landing site was known by the NCR, but by this time in the campaign, the northern side of the lake was largely abandoned, with the NCR having to constantly consolidate its forces around the dam and southern front. This was going to be a simple job. This was a job that had been done 100 other times by other Legion raiders along the North Lake. Falco's boat glided into a skid as it reached the sandbar, and immediately, the legionaries at the bow hopped off to bring it a bit further inland, while the group scout immediately set off. Moments later, the second boat did the same, and the soldiers of both vessels hopped out and stormed the shore, taking cover and congregating around the nearest trailer. When both raid groups were unloaded, the crews at the bow instantly turned the boats around facing the south with oars in place and readied for a rapid escape. When the crews rejoined the raiders, they waited a few more moments before the explorer returned. Upon entering the light of a single dim lantern, the explorer said to Falco in a whisper, "Decanus, no patrols, no sentries on duty. The refugee camp is ready for our taking. No activity from the ranger station to the east either." Just as Falco had heard, the refugee camp was wide open. Being the first raid on this side of the lake in many weeks, Falco did not think this simple slave raid would be this easy. Falco replied, "Excellent work. Keep watch with the oarsmen here." Turning to the two black silhouettes with plumed helms beside him, Falco said, "Recruit, you will be our vanguard. Silence any profligates, civilian or otherwise, who may be outside the camp. Remember, our directive is for the capture of these wretches. Though I have little doubt we can take the entirety of this camp with our force alone, our orders state no more than 6 slaves will be taken before we fall back." He glanced at the two heads of the prospective groups. "Keep your counts and give the signal once we have the proper number. Speed and subtlety is imperative, lest we raise the alarm of the nearby ranger station. So, blades only. Firearms will be kept in reserve for emergency. Now ready yourselves." As the two groups of raiders stowed their firearms and drew their blades or spears, the boat crews and explorers ducked behind the rocks and debris piles near the shoreline, ready to execute the escape. Just before both groups were ready, the prime Decanus in charge of Falco's team asked Falco, "My Primus, should I station a contingent to keep watch over the western canyon access? The pass near Coyote Tail Ridge is said to make an excellent means of a two-pronged approach to the camp." Falco thought about this for a second as the raiders of both groups drank water and studied the sharpness of their blades. After a short consideration, Falco said, "Negative. I want both groups together in case something goes wrong. No cutoff will happen tonight, and if this is going to happen in a timely manner, close communication is required." "Of course, Decanus Falco," said the prime officer. Although there was some worth in what the prime had said, the explorer only managed to give his observation of the main camp entrance and eastern ranger station. With no reconnaissance of the area west of camp, or the ridge overlooking the west entrance, Falco thought back to the raid intel that said there was almost nothing but desert and bleached old-world roads from there to the profligates' Camp Gulf a few miles west. Although the odd report said there was the occasional group of lake lurks or cazadores that roamed close to the nearby Calville Bay. If the worst happened and shots were fired, the last thing Falco wanted was to rouse the attention of any of those winged poisonous nightmares called cazadores. He'd heard what happened at Crimson River Trail during the Colorado campaign, and his force wasn't nearly strong enough to fend off a swarm of those beasts. Falco only told the Prime Decanus, "As I said, the two groups will stick together, but if anything happens on our west flank, whether creature or a stray patrol, you designate a contingent to buy the rest of us the necessary time to withdraw." The Prime Decanus replied simply, "Yes, Decanus," and proceeded to quietly designate 5 of his men with heavier reserve firepower to stall any activity in the west of their approach. When that was done, the raiders were ready. The oarsman and explorer were hidden in the cover around the boats, and Falco signaled the recruit Decanus to take the lead. When the last recruit in the recruit column exited the little trailer park, Falco hurriedly gave the signal to move as well. Falco took the center of the two groups, the perfect spot for him to issue commands to both of them, and the officer in charge of the Prime Contubernum led his raiders at a small distance behind Falco. Quickly and at a crouch, the raid teams approached the mouth of the refugee camp's entrance, nearing the canyon pass, sticking to the shadows under the moonlight with their footsteps buried beneath the slow winds of the night. The recruit raiders had made a little bit of distance ahead of Falco, but just as they all reached the canyon entrance, he heard a slight scream of a woman that was almost instantly silenced. Falco missed what it was as he focused on the Prime's advance, but a moment later, he saw one of the recruits dragging a woman with a gag over her mouth back towards the trailer park. Just before the recruit passed, Falco caught him by the collar and motioned for one of the Primes to carry on with the delivery back to the boats. The designated Prime wordlessly did so, and Falco asked the lowly recruit, "What's the situation?" Just then he eyed the rest of the recruit group staying put by the entrance, seeming to listen for any aroused suspicion further into camp, when the recruit replied in a whisper. The profligate was gathering water outside camp, my Primus. Falco understood that and thought, that's one capture. The short scream didn't appear to arouse any suspicion thus far, but he didn't know if the enemy was perhaps setting up an ambush of sorts. With both groups temporarily halted, Falco said to the recruit, "Order your Decanus to storm the camp. The Primes are moving up as well. Raid the camp and send any captives to the rear. We're getting out of here as soon as possible." "Right away, my Primus," said the recruit as he ran at a quick and quiet pace back to his commander. When the recruit was halfway there, Falco motioned for the Primes to proceed onward, and Falco left the small rock formation he was hiding behind to join the recruits near the entrance. However, just as Falco left his cover, he felt a small piece of his neck muscle get torn away, and he found himself on the floor just as he heard the loud crack. The recruits had stormed the camp. Half the Primes began charging the entrance, while the other half stormed the west, unleashing a hail of gunfire in that direction, as the Prime Decanus dropped down to Falco's side screaming, "My Primus, are you intact?" Falco barely heard the officer kneeling over him as he was deafened by the nearby gunfire and focused on the amount of blood gushing over his hands. He raised his head at the Prime's protest, but saw 2 of the Primes get dropped on their way to the canyon entrance. He heard the incessant gunfire being poured onto the enemy in the west. Falco stumbled to his feet, again at the Prime's protest, but when he arose, he heard more sounds of battle deep in the refugee camp and turned to the west just in time to see a bullet ricochet off the collection of rocks. Raising his focus where the bullet struck the little ridge sitting there in the distance, he thought he saw a lone figure atop the landmarked Coyote Tail Ridge, but the sounds of some awful battle continued in the camp itself. Falco had heard that the profligate soldiers in the camp had often given up or allowed previous raiders to take whoever they wanted, but the sounds in the canyon were unlike anything expected. Falco then shuffled towards the west as yet another bullet from the landmark ridge whistled by him, and he fired a few of his own shots in that direction deliriously as more blood trickled down his neck, pooling in the area around his chest and protective plates. One of the Primes suppressing the aggressor in the west fell to the sniper on the ridge, and Falco's attention was turned back to the camp entrance. 3 recruits with 3 captures rounded a turn in the rock when 2 of the legionaries collapsed in a hail of bullets before they could escape with their slaves. Those 2 slaves fled back into the camp while the last recruit stormed past the Primes by the entrance. Immediately, Falco turned to the Prime officer and said to him in a voice weak from blood loss and that bullet wound, "Rally the others. We're falling back with what we have." Without question, the Prime screamed at his soldiers battling the sniper on the ridge for them to return to the boats, and Falco turned one more time back to the canyon. The Prime Decanus dashed to cover closer to the entrance and shouted for his few survivors to fall back. The recruit with the second capture stormed past Falco towards the trailers, and Falco saw a figure completely blackened by the darkness of night emerge from the entryway. Even if it wasn't so dark out, Falco couldn't see who or what the figure in the camp was because it immediately hid behind the rocks once again, as the Primes suppressed the entryway in their retreat. With a few blind shots, Falco felt the bullets from the mysterious camp defender whistle past him as he joined the withdrawal back to the boats. 2 more Primes fell along the way, but all the surviving raiders piled into the boats and were moving back south towards the lakeside encampment before the dust settled. Falco felt himself nodding off, continually pressing his hand to his neck as more blood poured. The surviving Prime Decanus wrapped Decanus Falco's neck with a bandage that instantly became soaked. And even in his half-conscious state, Falco did his count. The entire recruit raid group hadn't returned from the battle in the camp, save for one lowly recruit with the second slave. 6 of the Primes made it out, including the officer, and all they had to show for it were 2 slaves sitting on the nearly vacant second boat, one of which took a bullet in the leg and might not even survive the trip across the lake. Of the 28 to take part in this raid, 15 had perished, and everyone aside from the oarsman and scout had taken some kind of injury before they could abscond with only 2 slaves. Falco had no idea who could have hindered such an operation with such force. Falco only saw or thought he saw 2 aggressors who he assumed to be rangers, the sniper on the ridge and whoever tried to emerge from the camp. But even then, Falco had fought whole teams of rangers throughout the south with half the force he had this night, and none of them fought like that. There were likely more of them, Falco thought absently, as he felt himself get even weaker from the blood loss. Either way, the raid was a success by their capture of at least 1 slave, but Falco knew his Primus was expecting better, and certainly not as many losses. Did my leadership give the right calls for this situation, or should I have expected such an adversary, and perhaps died here too? Thought Falco, both questions boiling down to, did I succeed, or did I fail? Both were hard to figure. One would have been expected under Montano, but Alaron was different, so Falco didn't know. The boats got steadily further from the north shore, while the fires across the enormous lakeside encampment got closer. Little by little, the boats went along, and Falco fell into a short but deep sleep. That same night, just like most nights, Alaron concluded his evening with a fire in the center of his command tent. Alaron stared into the flame, watching the smoke billow up and out of the hole in the top. The only way this night was different from the others was the fact that this night was when he did his usual meetings with the rest of his staff. Still, this night was unique in that Falco wasn't here. Normally, Alaron would have put off the regular check-in with his staff if one of them was out on an important errand. But Alaron knew all that Falco had to report since he'd kept the man so close over the months. Alaron wondered how his newest staff officer was doing on the first raid north of the lake in several weeks, and briefly wondered if such a task was worthy of Falco's position. Alaron knew just as well as any of the commanders and officers in the lakeside encampment that the raid on Bitter Springs refugee camp was practically a sure thing for any raiders that went that way. From everything he heard over the months and even years on the campaign, Bitter Springs was an easy source of slaves. It was the kind of place the Legion would raid when the terror forces in the south were bogged down for too long, or a simple way to show that the Legion was still to be feared beyond the south. In the end, Alaron's worry lay primarily in the fact that the task would be too easy for Falco. By this time, Falco had shown himself to be one of, if not the most dependable member of his staff. Montano certainly chose the right man, Alaron thought, just as he thought on many nights with Falco by his side, and internally acknowledged the fact that Falco's current competence was likely to have been carefully crafted over a long time by Montano. Still, over the weeks with Falco under his authority, Alaron had become more than aware of the kinds of action Falco had seen. Alaron had spent many nights with Falco, hearing all kinds of stories from the man about how Montano raised him to his staff for his actions during the battle at Roswell, when he was only a lowly recruit, and how the man served Montano excellently across the following meat grinder or Colorado campaign. Falco was more than experienced. He was the go-to man for Montano, fighting in all the same battles and campaigns, taking injuries, and recovering just in time to join each and every charge his former centurion led. The conclusion Alaron gathered was that any task he could give the veteran Decanus from his current station would be wildly beneath what the man was qualified for. Still, Alaron knew that Falco's spirit was still partially mired in the trash after his failure to die in captivity by his former Centurion's side. Because of this, Alaron intended to slowly restore Falco's confidence in the days after raising him out of slavery. The only issue with this was that Alaron was still the head of administration for Fortification Hill, a station that unfortunately limited his exposure to the kind of action still going on across the southern end of the front. Alaron still considered the idea of requesting a transfer to Nelson in order to die in an attack on Forlorn Hope. By this point, he heard that the profligate front line was on the verge of completely shattering. Despite this, however, he heard that the full-scale assaults on them were temporarily halted. Hearing the two pieces of news led Alaron to further frustration regarding what exactly Caesar was planning. But the cease in assaults on the front line hinted at the impending attack on Hoover Dam if the gossip of other Centurions was to be believed. Alaron put his hopes in that, and never petitioned for the transfer despite how unlikely the attack on the dam was in the near future. Coupled with the knowledge of what happened to Montano in his attack on Forlorn Hope, as well as the news that Legate Lanius was on his way from the east, Alaron knew it was best to stay put and remain in his role, no matter how much longer it would be put off. Even though he worried that his current role might prevent his direct involvement in the assault on Hoover Dam, he knew there weren't many other ways the situation across the front could frustrate him. And so, Alaron continued to have limited use on the front as a centurion of his veterancy, and the question remained about what to do to restore Falco's faith in himself. 2 nights previously, Alaron was approached by one of the reserve centurions about a raid group that was being summoned for actions along the north shore of the lake. Alaron used his authority to take the role from the previous commander assigned to the task and saw it as the perfect way to push Falco back into direct battlefield service. Alaron's only wish was that he could have joined his subordinate on the raid. But alas, it was staff check-in night, and Lucius was demanding regular updates on all matters of the fort and lakeside encampment. That night, Falco left his notes about unit inventories and reserve sentries on Alaron's desk, and was ordered to immediately depart. After a majority of the typical day-to-day matters were out of the way, Alaron realized he'd been lost in thought for long enough, and finally broke his gaze from the flame to see his other 3 staff officers still sitting around the fire. He glanced at Gabriella, who was still doing her part of crafting a letter for the one in charge of Montano's old slaves and servants out in New Mexico. Regardless, Alaron still wanted little if anything to do with matters of Montano's faraway lands or properties, so he had Gabriella put in charge of communications with the head of Montano's lands. Despite learning the head of Montano's lands was a veteran decanus of the Recuperatio Unitatis named Erastus, all the return letters came from Montano's longtime slave woman called Clara. Although Alaron was surprised to learn that Clara remained alive and was apparently in charge of Montano's lands. Alaron had Gabriella handling any issues about the lands in order to avoid yet another source of headache while he was attached to this front. At last, with all the standard reports out of the way, Alaron saw that the rest of the staff was still waiting to either be dismissed or report anything else. Remembering he still had plenty of side business in his role, Alaron asked his vexillarius, Decius. "Yes, my primus?" said the standard-bearer, immediately snapped out of his daydream. "Have you received word from Lucius in response to my request to collapse the weather station?" "Unfortunately not, my primus. I did take the initiative to inquire about the status of that request from one of his runners this afternoon, though. Still no word to report." Alaron thought out loud, not surprised. I would truly be surprised if such a thing were even possible. Alaron thought back to when he was in charge of the front and how their attempt to open the interior doors and structure itself withstood the detonation of 2 crates full of Composition 4. Still, the memory of this brought up the recent events at the fort and the reason he asked for the permission in the first place. Alaron asked Decius, "Did the runner give details on what Lucius or Lord Caesar intends to do with the structure now that it has been accessed and the contents destroyed?" Decius thought for a second before saying, "All he said is that the structure's interior remains off limits to all personnel under strict orders from Lord Caesar." Alaron again thought for a moment about the mysterious building that occupied the top of the fort since the front was established and thought back to the recent events around the fort. It was true that Alaron was still largely discontent with the return to his menial role after the excitement around Caesar's health. But the odd report had come to Alaron's attention in the past couple weeks that Alaron couldn't quite make heads or tails of. In particular, Alaron thought about the strange night he went through roughly 2 or so weeks prior, and what later followed. Alaron was awoken in the dead of night by his staff officer called Valerian, who was leading gate security that evening. Valerian told Alaron of a suspicious situation that required his address. Now, it was common for battle groups, patrols, or runners from the south to return to the fort and check in with Alaron or the officer he had in charge of gate security. This was such an uneventful role that had been done by him over 1,000 times since Caesar took charge of the front, but the situation Valerian reported was indeed a unique one. Alaron was told that one of the groups that came up from the south was a contubernium reassigned to a centurion within the fort's reserve, but there was one addition to the group that claimed to be a messenger. It wasn't uncommon for incoming groups from the south to include the odd runner with their own separate orders from whoever they crossed the river with. But this runner was dressed as a lowly recruit instead of the normal explorer vestments of a typical runner. This particular runner entered the fort and was escorted to the accountability formation with the party he arrived with. However, it was the runner's sense of urgency that roused the suspicion of Valerian. Valerian said that the recruit runner constantly attempted to break formation before he could check in with himself or the directive's coordinator. When pressed about why the recruit couldn't stand in place before he could be sent the proper direction, the recruit said that he had urgent orders to carry out. All runners, no matter if they were on an urgent assignment, awaited to fulfill their duty in the correct custom of arrival at a legion fortification. Disliking this recruit's failure to follow proper protocol, Valerian had the soldiers stand by under armed supervision while he fetched Alaron. Alaron remembered standing before the recruit that night, and how the masked man looked at him from behind his goggles. Just by the slouched and casual way this runner was sitting, Alaron thought he was the stupidest recruit he'd ever seen. Not only this, but he failed to rise in the presence of Alaron dressed in his entire centurion garb. However, instead of beating this recruit to death right then and there, Alaron asked him sternly, "Tell me your name, recruit legionary." It was usually pretty easy to tell the experience of a legionary just by the way he talked or the tone of his voice, even if they weren't in the armor befitting their rank. This recruit, however, spoke as one who'd never even set foot inside a soldier camp. The recruit runner answered, "Legionary Benjamanicus, sir." The reader may remember that recruit legionaries typically weren't even given a name until they became a decanus of that veterancy or did something notable enough to earn a means of address, like in the case of Falco during the fall of New Mexico. Either way, this recruit clearly did no such thing worthy of a name. Not only was his posture a dead giveaway, but Alaron had never been called sir in his entire life. By slaves, Alaron was addressed as master. By legionaries, he was addressed as Centurion Alaron, Centurion or primus, along with the appropriate word, my, used as a preface before the usual address. The only exception to these titles was the word sire, that was typically used in the sort of battlefield situation where the other forms of address were deemed impractical in an emergency moment. Already knowing this recruit was some sort of infiltrator, Alaron knew from his time alongside Dalton the Frumentarius back in the day that sometimes it was best to let Caesar's enemies make their mistakes. After all, it was rude to interrupt the enemy when they were in the middle of doing something foolish. At the same time, Alaron saw this infiltrator and hoped to understand his intentions before reporting him to the Praetorians or Frumentarii. The second question came when Alaron said, "From what station on the southern front do you belong?" The recruit imposter said simply, "Nelson, Centurion." He corrected his error, but it's pronounced Centurion, not this Centurion idiocy. Not to mention he forgot the preface, my Centurion. The fucking degenerate, thought Alaron as he asked. "You come from the command of Centurion Dead Sea, then?" "Yes, Centurion. I have an important message from him to deliver." Alaron was excellent at not showing any emotion when he needed to keep his figure as authoritative and professional as possible. This is why he didn't burst out laughing when the imposter gave himself away further by not correcting the Centurion title given to the Decanus, commander of Nelson named Dead Sea. Alaron only questioned further. Is it from him that you've come with your message? The impostor said yes, and Alaron immediately asked, for whom is your message to be delivered? Alaron considered asking the impostor for his orders. Orders from runners could have consisted of official papers stamped with the bull to whatever the issuing officer had on hand, with only a signature denoting their official status. However, Alaron knew that the man wouldn't have anything, and instead of seizing the infiltrator right there, he wanted to know what exactly this person hoped to accomplish by signing his own death warrant. As Alaron thought, his question was answered by the impostor. My orders are for the one in charge of this place. Please, sir, you must let me go. My orders are for his ears only. Alaron knew the impostor wasn't stupid enough to be talking about Caesar himself. Caesar wouldn't even meet with a veteran centurion like Alaron, no matter how important the business was, let alone meet with some recruit runner under the authority of the non-existent centurion Dead Sea. So, the impostor's vague response was perfectly addressed to Alaron as head of the fort's operations. Alaron humored the man, curious to hear what was for his ears only. Alaron answered, I am he. I am Centurion Alaron. I am the one you will report to as the head of fortress operations. The recruit was stumped for a moment, and Alaron seriously considered ripping off the mask to finally see the face of this spy before putting a bullet in each of his spying eyes. The impostor didn't hesitate for long, and the man said to Alaron, Great. Centurion Dead Sea says he needs more soldiers. Profligates attacked the other night. Lost a lot of legionaries. This was usually when Alaron would have asked for the orders if he hadn't already taken them from the runner on any other occasion. Instead, Alaron asked simply, How many soldiers does he need? After a moment, the impostor said, 12. Sir. 1 contubernium and 1 explorer, perhaps? Asked Alaron. That's it, sir. That's what he said, replied the impostor. What veterancy, thought Alaron before he'd already had his fill of this pointless discussion. Alaron actually said to the spy, Consider it done. Anything else Centurion Dead Sea requires? Nope, no sir, said the impostor, and Alaron smiled insidiously, pointing to the gate. Now go. Alaron turned to Valerian and added for his staff officer right in front of the infiltrator. Collect a prime contubernium from the reserve pool and fetch an explorer. At the same time, Alaron telepathically told Valerian, Find Lucius immediately. Praetorians must be on high alert. We have an infiltrator in the camp. Valerian departed immediately, and Alaron turned back to the impostor, who stuttered in a slight panic at being told to leave. This prompted the impostor to say, Sir, I was told to stay the night here. I'm supposed to head back in the morning. Of course, said Alaron militarily before adding, There are lodgings for passing forces down at the lakeside encampment, as well as up there in the fort's interior just past the arena. Alaron pointed to each direction respectively and motioned for the sentries to stand down. Upon dismissal, Alaron wanted to see whether or not the spy would go to the lakeside encampment, where 99% of all the other passing forces stayed, or if he would go up to the interior of the fort that housed Lord Caesar's command domicile. The infiltrator stood up and said, Thank you, Centurion Alaron. True to Caesar. True to Caesar, said Alaron, trying even harder to keep his composure after hearing the spy pronounce Lord Caesar's name like a dissolute, instead of the correct pronunciation of the word being Caesar. Just before the impostor departed towards the fort's interior as expected, Alaron said, Legionary. The impostor stopped and Alaron added, You will remove your mask now unless you are on duty. The impostor hesitated for a moment and acknowledged, lowering his mask and exposing a baby face that again almost made Alaron burst into hysteria. Not even a bruise was on the impostor's face. Even if the recruit impostor hadn't been in service long enough to show the scars of war, his face certainly would have been more black and blue from abuse in soldier camp. Regardless, the infiltrator set off, keeping his helmet on, and up the winding path he went towards the top of Fortification Hill. Alaron dismissed the others of the incoming group and motioned towards the gate sentries. Follow. Alaron marched up the path to the fort's interior with 3 battle-equipped veteran legionaries, and just as expected, Valerian had delivered the news to Lucius. Beyond the hustle and bustle of the busy interior sector, Alaron saw the line of Praetorians standing shoulder to shoulder around Caesar's tent on high alert. Alaron didn't know where the infiltrator was, but he knew Caesar was safe, and so he approached the large command tent of Lord Caesar on the highest point of the fortification. Stopping outside the entrance, Alaron met with Lucius standing directly outside, who said to him, "Centurion Alaron, where is this infiltrator?" "He's here in the interior," said Alaron, but before he could say any more, a helmeted Decanus approached them and said, "I beg pardon for the interruption, Praetorian and Centurion, but there is a legionary without authorization seeking entry to the weather station." Immediately, Alaron and Lucius walked towards the north end of the interior at the edge of the cliff where the weather station stood, and saw a lone figure seemingly waiting for the sentry by the door to leave or something. "That him?" asked Lucius, pointing to the silhouette hiding in the shadow of the structure. "Yes, Praetorian," said Alaron, immediately disgusted with the infiltrator's posture. Without word, Lucius ordered Alaron to restrain him, and Alaron did just that. Before the infiltrator even knew it, or could let out a shout, Alaron and his guards had brought the man to the dirt. Pulling him up to his feet, and after a spree of curses, the man struggled in the grip of 3 legionaries until the impostor was brought under the lamp of the building. Immediately, the butt of a rifle sent him back down to his knees, and Alaron asked, "So, recruit legionary, where is your helmet?" Under the lamp, Alaron stood looking down at the impostor, kneeling there, with a shiny head of greased dark brown hair. The impostor's answer to Alaron's question was a simple, "It ain't what it seems, skirt boy," as he struggled even more in the grip. Alaron let the hostile words slide for the moment, and instead marveled at the infiltrator's hair, saying, "If everything you've done and said since arriving at Caesar's fortress didn't give you away, that hair certainly did." The impostor caught his breath and resigned himself to his position before he met Alaron's eyes and said, "What can I say? A chiseled mug and head of hair like mine ain't meant for hiding under a legion mask. Ain't that right, Blue Eyes? If it weren't for them scars, dirt, and perma scowl, you'd have a face to make the Vegas broad swoon, you dig, baby?" Before the infiltrator could spew any more nonsense out of his mouth, Alaron's fist collided with the man's face and he drooped into temporary unconsciousness. Wiping the blood of the spy's jaw off his knuckles, Alaron said to the guards, "Search him." Beyond the comb and half-empty bottle of hair gel that was presumably used to fix his hair after removing his helmet, the infiltrator didn't have much on him other than the standard kit of a recruit legionary. However, in his field pack was a suit with the ugliest black and white checker pattern Alaron didn't think existed, as well as an engraved 9mm handgun seeming to say that this spy wasn't some kind of NCR infiltrator. These few notable belongings continued to be set aside on the ground nearby as the search continued, and the impostor slowly recovered from such a hit. Moments after the suit was splayed out on the ground under the lamp, Lucius approached with a look of confusion or surprise. It almost appeared as though Lucius was familiar with who this person was. Not long after Lucius took his place beside Alaron, Lucius asked the centurion, "Anything else on him?" Looking to the legionaries conducting the search on the limp body, Alaron asked them, "Is that everything?" "I believe so, Primus," said one of the veterans before halting himself. There, in a small pocket on the impostor's canteen pouch, one of the sentries removed a silver-looking object about the same size as a Legion Aureus coin. Before the glittering object could be handed to Alaron, Lucius intercepted it from the sentry's hand and held it under the lamplight. "Is that important, Praetorian?" asked Alaron, only catching a glimpse of the thing. Lucius held it under the light at different angles and motioned for Alaron to look as well, saying seriously, "It might be." Alaron saw the glittering coin and saw the familiar mark of the Lucky 38 Casino engraved on the face. Alaron looked up, saw the weather station they stood beside. Lucius did likewise, and suddenly the infiltrator looked a lot more interesting. Just then, the impostor came around, and just in time too. The impostor was hauled back up onto his knees and struggled with where he was, only to be brought back to reality by Lucius demanding, "What is this for?" The prisoner stayed silent but looked to Alaron, asking for another punch that would not come, and Alaron stayed his hand in the ensuing silence until Lucius turned to Alaron. "Alaron," he paused, "I'll handle this from here. You may depart." As interested in this strange infiltrator as he was, it was time to go, and Alaron was not permitted to learn any more than what he happened to oversee. That night only added to the already large pile of frustrations Alaron had come across on this front. Fortunately for him, he was already very numb to the feelings this kind of unexpected frustration gave him, and he had become an expert at not lingering on these feelings. The amount of mysteries and unknowns across the front, especially in recent days, would continue to grow, but unfortunately, few of them were relevant to his story. This is why Alaron again had to suppress his curiosities and wishes to know more, even after the events 2 days later. Alaron wasn't there for the arrival of the later famous individual known across the Mojave as the Courier. Alaron was fairly jealous that the Courier received an audience with Lord Caesar himself after deeds that Alaron had only heard about in passing rumors. Alaron was firmly confined to his own station, and even the occasional brush with what was happening in the bigger picture was quickly suppressed when there were matters of the fort to attend to. Despite this, Alaron could only sit on the sidelines, even when the world beyond his direct authority gave its resounding explosion across the wasteland. Alaron, just like everyone else at the fort, felt the ground rock on the day the contents beneath the weather station were handled by the Courier. All Alaron knew was that the place beneath Caesar's fortress on this front, a place that was inaccessible to Caesar himself, opened wide for the Courier. Alaron wanted to survey the wreckage of the facility beneath the weather station, but the world and life on the front simply moved right along as more concerns were handled and the Courier disappeared into the wastes again. The only conclusion Alaron ever got about the whole ordeal was when he watched the body of the fort's infiltrator get dragged from the interior to one of the mass graves near the lakeside encampment. At last, Alaron had dwelled on the events of past weeks long enough and struggled to find anything else to say in this evening's meeting. Remembering that there still had been no new word about his petition to bury the remaining legacy of that weather station, Alaron concluded that there was nothing more for this night's staff meeting. Alaron dismissed them, and each officer filed out of the tent, leaving Alaron alone with his thoughts about the recent weeks and what the coming weeks could entail. Alaron got to thinking even more about that strange Courier, and all the even stranger stories associated with the character. Little had changed for Alaron, but all the intelligence he received about the Courier again only frustrated him. Last he heard, the day the earth shook beneath the fort was the same day that the Courier was supposedly dispatched with killing the one known as Mr. House. Alaron still had yet to hear whether or not that assassination had happened, but the thought only made him realize once again how low on the ladder he now was. Stuck at a position that limited his use and restricted him from getting more responsibility, the thought occurred to him once more that the dam was only waiting to fall. In the meantime, vague reports and rumors about that Courier continued to come to Alaron's attention. From everything Alaron gathered about the Courier, what little that was or how vague it was, Alaron could only conclude that he didn't like them. Based on the reports about the Courier helping the profligates in a situation at Boulder City, being seen around McCarran, helping defend a town of dynamite-slinging outlaws, accepting the mark of Caesar, creating an earthquake beneath Fortification Hill, and disappearing into the wastes until the next story comes out, all of it made Alaron feel even more little in his position. Was this Courier an ally of the Legion or an enemy? Nothing was known for certain at this point. The only thing Alaron was sure of was the fact that the earth tended to shake wherever the Courier was. Metaphorically or otherwise didn't matter. This individual was a dangerous one. The best thing to happen to the Legion or the worst thing. Either way, this individual's arrival in the scheme of things worried Alaron at a time when Caesar seemingly wasn't. Caesar was becoming more and more of a gambler, with everything between his own health and matters of the campaign's success. And yet, the biggest unknown wildcard to enter any Legion front was a single person. Roughly 20 minutes had passed when someone entered Alaron's tent. To his surprise, the new arrival was not anyone he expected, but was instead the Praetorian Lucius. Upon noticing Gabriella hadn't awoken at the Praetorian's entrance, he was about to order her when Lucius put a halt to the notion. Alaron stood for his hail, but again was stopped by Lucius, who silently took his seat on the opposite side of Alaron's desk. When Lucius was seated in front of Alaron, a brief silence ensued while the expression on the face of Lucius remained stern. This continued for a few long moments until Lucius looked down at the paper Alaron had in front. It wasn't an official report or anything, it was only a small sheet of parchment that was previously blank, before Alaron had unconsciously scribbled a number of notes pertaining to all he knew about that strange courier. During his long contemplation after the staff departed, Lucius wordlessly took notice of this and turned the paper around to read it. After a brief study, Lucius looked up to Alaron with a partially raised eyebrow and broke the silence. Loyalty suspected, dangerous wildcard, requests permission from Lucius to interrogate. Lucius quoted from the paper. Alaron remained steady in his posture, continuing to meet the eyes of Lucius before the Praetorian added, "Do you plan on stamping this, Centurion?" Alaron let out the smallest whisper of a laugh. Should the Praetorian or Lord Caesar deem it worthy of action, yes. Alaron wasn't surprised at all when Lucius only folded the paper and placed it in the basket full of other discarded papers beside Alaron's desk. The expected action caused Alaron to ask, "Am I to assume that my request to bury the weather station suffered a similar fate?" Lucius nodded, telling Alaron all he needed to, but the expression on the Praetorian's face was one stained by his own frustrations. Lucius liked working with Alaron. He especially liked working with the Lord Interfector back when he was around, and so he had an unspoken friendliness with Alaron as well, especially after all he'd done for the front before Lord Caesar's arrival. Alaron waited for the Praetorian to begin the cause of this meeting, and Lucius finally obliged when Alaron's desk was cleared. Lucius said cordially in a low tone so as to not disturb the sleeping servant, "Centurion Alaron, I understand your frustrations with the way the front is progressing, but it is my duty to remind you that you have your station that Lord Caesar has entrusted you with. I fear you may be at risk of overstepping your authority with such reports." Alaron saw the same frustrations on the face of Lucius remain despite the words he spoke, and upon meeting one another's gaze, Alaron received the unspoken permission to speak. "Frankly, Praetorian, I do not understand the plans for this front. I am not the only one who knows that the dam should have already fallen weeks if not months ago." The Praetorian stayed still and silent, only mentally nodding at the Centurion's words. Lord Caesar appears perfectly fine with his impending demise, and the legate can arrive in a matter of days, weeks, or who even knows how long. This front, this campaign has already been completely unlike anything you, me, or even Lord Caesar himself had undergone. It has been 4 years since this front was established, and yet the only tangible victories we've seen are in the south. All I can say is that almost the entirety of Colorado had fallen to Caesar in the same amount of time, and the reason we have not already taken Vegas remains a great mystery to myself and every other commander on the front, including you. Alaron paused, and the Praetorian took in all these facts. Lucius considered them over and over again for several long moments before looking up to meet Alaron's eyes once more. "You're right, Alaron. This campaign is unlike anything else we've undergone. It is because of the loss under the old legate and intelligence from the lands beyond the dam that are making Lord Caesar extra cautious with every action before the climax of this front. I share our Lord's concerns with the factions and people beyond, but just understand that the wait will pay off. The dam will fall, and all the concerns beyond the wall will be dealt with in a manner that will expedite the following conquest of the city. I only hope that you remember that I was at the dam the first time as well, Alaron, as well as Boulder City. I too will ensure that something like that never happens again. But we must remain excellent in our entrusted stations and rest our entire trust and faith in Lord Caesar's hands. You see?" Lucius paused and Alaron continued to listen. "This invasion of the West is not like our previous invasions. The end of this campaign will formally mark the transition of our legion into something far beyond what we've been capable of being previously." Alaron's curiosity was raised even more until Lucius asked, "Are you familiar with Lord Caesar's namesake?" Alaron was familiar, but what he knew of ancient Rome and Caesar's namesake was just as alien as what he knew about the old world. Alaron nodded, but Lucius knew he wasn't aware of what exactly he was talking about. Lucius went on, "For years, Julius Caesar campaigned in the lands of Gaul, conquering territory and absorbing the savages of the land into the empire of his home. However, each victory came with less glory for the state of Rome and more glory to the banner of the bull or the man carrying it. By the time the first Caesar began his march home, his men were no longer loyal to Rome. They were loyal to the man who led them to victory. Lucius paused once more, and Alaron was entranced. Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon River, returned to the land of his birth, and took the seat of glory that he rightfully earned after so much conquest. This return forever changed the Roman Republic and united the corrupt government that stood for civilization in name only under himself. Lord Caesar is the same. Lord Caesar will return to the land of his birth, and in crossing the Colorado, he will change the very foundation of what we are. No longer will we be the force that occupies the East. We will become the force, the nation that governs the East and West on behalf of our emperor. What was done after the Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado campaigns will be done again on an even larger scale with the resources of our new Rome, the city of New Vegas. Upon seizing Vegas, we will spark the civil war between Caesar of old and the corrupt republic of the current West. The wars will continue, yet we will change, and Caesar has only been taking this time to ensure that vision comes to realization, even if he is to die. Do you understand? Alaron nodded silently and was stuck in thought. He knew that this war would change everything about the Legion and what they valued, who they served, who they fought, what they fought, and what their future would come to. Despite everything he had just heard, Alaron continued to be troubled by the amount of inaction, the failing health of the emperor, and the most pressing issue of the recent days, the one person who continuously shook the earth wherever they went. At last, Alaron saw past the proclamation of Lucius and looked deep into the mix of worry and frustration hidden behind that pride of what the future entailed. Alaron said, "And yet in the meantime, there's some wildcard out there of the utmost importance who we can't tell if they're loyal to us or one of the innumerable groups of profligates to inhabit the desert." Lucius had met with the courier during the visit with Caesar, and two could not come to the vaguest conclusions about their loyalty. Lucius thought how Lord Caesar seemed completely content with his message for the messenger, yet even the emperor's confidence in the individual did little to quell the worries in the Praetorian's mind. Lucius was glad that he wasn't the only one who worried about the individual, but where he differed from Alaron was the amount of trust he was willing to put into his emperor to quell those worries. Lucius saw all these issues continue to weigh on Alaron's mind before saying slowly and deliberately, "Lord Caesar is still in charge, Alaron, so I'll ask you to place the remainder of your worries in his hands. Caesar is the bull, and whether Caesar lives for a few more weeks, months, or decades, doesn't matter. Caesar will lead us to victory." He paused once more, seeing how even this reminder did little for Alaron, who'd been in his idle position of decreasing responsibility long enough for the world outside the Legion to have. Wait. Lucius realized this and sought to quell those lingering questions about what the outcome of everything and the arrival of the strange courier meant to a man like Alaron. Some things don't need explanations. How the Legion will change, what the courier means, etc. All is irrelevant when only time will tell. Some things just require those like you who will see it all through. You aren't alone in having misgivings and worries about the Mojavian Front's new wild card. But do you know who else was a wild card? His thoughts interrupted, Alaron looked up at the question. Lord Interfector was, said Lucius, causing Alaron to remember the man and all he'd been through with him. Lucius saw this reaction and added, so was Montano, and so were you. Hearing his own name in comparison to that strange courier captured Alaron's attention like never before, as Lucius reminded him of both the Lord Interfector and his rival Montano. Lucius saw that his words hit Alaron further and went on. The Lord Interfector was a drifter who fought against the Legion throughout southern Arizona after he shook the earth with his own arrival in 2261. But even he ultimately bowed to Caesar. Lucius scoffed to himself after a brief moment of recollection. I remember the second day that I was a member of the Praetorian Guard and I heard who the Interfector was. It was a well-known event amongst the guard when that guy knelt before Caesar the first time with that idiot from Scottsdale by his side. Caesar had little intention of keeping him around after the fall of Phoenix later that year, but look how far he went. He broke into a trance of remembrance as he thought about all he'd done to coordinate with that man since joining the Praetorians in 68. Then Lucius looked up to Alaron again and said, yet even that man went unquestioningly into the divide for Lord Caesar. Alaron thought about the day he overheard the talk between the Interfector and Graham. Remembering both men in their positions of so much glory and prestige, but how both of them were shown to be the tragic men they were underneath it all when everything was out in the open. Then there's Montano, added Lucius, again capturing Aileron's focus. I don't need to tell you how Montano was a wild card, an unknown figure that broke the ranks and fought back against his arrest, despite all the procedural guidelines broken by his defiance to the messenger. Lucius looked at Aileron directly. Aileron wasn't in the least bit surprised that the Praetorian knew the origin of Montano's renown, and how Aileron himself was the reason for it. That man went on to butcher across the East for decades, leaving a legacy that would rival our very own Legatus Lanius. A legacy of terror that can still be seen in the radioactive cloud around what used to be Camp Searchlight. Aileron heard about what happened to Searchlight, but it never occurred to him that Montano would be even partially responsible for what happened there. Even if it was just through a casual report about Montano's suggestion for frumentary intervention. Lucius continued, I've heard about Montano's end at Camp Forlorn Hope, too. And yes, I know you spared his senior, Falco. Aileron was briefly gripped by worry at the Praetorian's confession, but that worry subsided when he saw the face of Lucius, that had not changed, even as he said, and that brings us to you, Aileron. Aileron waited, hearing about all these people who created impactful wakes wherever they went, and how he knew who they were. Just like the courier, Aileron too was one of those wild cards that openly defied the Legion, yet still caused a thunderous explosion that altered so much about the Legion. Lucius concluded with a statement to Aileron's own soul. Aileron was his own wild card that regularly broke protocol to fight his rival in countless illegal duels throughout the years. Aileron and Montano could have been crucified 100 times over for their insubordination, but Aileron knew his actions would be safe under the authority of his wild card commander. Still, Aileron fought, because Aileron was enlightened about what that first fight sparked. Decades of triumph across the East ensued, and his defiance of the bull for revenge against Montano created a spiritual wave that echoed across every front since that fight, reaching even the lowest recruits who knew that Aileron and Montano only fought one another for their loyalty to the banner and emperor they served. Regardless of the contradiction between failing their lord by their personal behavior and subsequently propelling their master's banner forward, Aileron's heart was entirely Legion. Lucius stopped, letting Aileron remember everything he brought up and where all that stood in the present. The minutes passed, and Aileron recalled his entire life, all he'd fought through, who he fought, the times he failed, and the times those failures brought about greater victories. Aileron's mind continued to swirl until he finally arrived at the present day, and at last, he looked up to meet the eyes of the Praetorian Lucius, who addressed what all this meant in the current hour. Whether or not Caesar survives till the end of this campaign, and whether or not the courier remains loyal to us or the enemy, you, Aileron, will carry the banner forward till the day you die. Just like the Lord Interfector, and just like Montano. What that looks like, I trust you'll know when the front finally moves. But for now, we wait, and you will only have unquestioning faith in the Emperor of today. Just like that, both men were rendered completely silent. With nothing to do yet plenty to do before the front moves, Aileron had heard what he needed to hear. Whatever that future was going to hold, whether it was with Caesar, without Caesar, with the courier's support, or with the courier's interference, Aileron would march the banner forward, just like the Interfector. Just like Montano, till the day he dies. It was unknown how much time had passed, but Lucius eventually departed Aileron's tent, and neither exchanged any more departing words. All that needed to be said was said, and Aileron felt ready for the future of this front. However that future might look. But there was only one question that needed to be addressed before Aileron could join his servant in sleep. It wasn't more than 5 minutes after Lucius departed when that question came walking through the tent flaps. Falco stumbled into the domicile with a blood-dripping rag still pressed to his neck, clearly delirious from healing powder and blood loss. Despite the nature of the veteran's return, Aileron remained seated and silently watching Falco as he dropped to his knees before the desk. Falco slurred out his hail to Caesar, before Aileron only returned with a raising of his hand. Just then, Aileron studied the battered state of Falco, slightly surprised that his simple slave run north of the lake caused such injuries. As the Decanus knelt there in the ensuing silence, Alaron finally asked his subordinate completely calmly and ready for whatever misfortunate news was next in regard to the front. "Who assaulted you?" asked the centurion dryly, remembering his new conviction. Breathing heavily in and out, Falco captured his agonizing breath so he could return. "I do not know, Primus. 2 captures obtained. Profligate ambush. 15 legionaries dead. 8 injured." Falco stopped when Alaron raised his hand. Alaron thought for a moment about the costly mission of his subordinate, but mostly about everything Lucius left him with. At last, enough silence had passed, and Falco collected his breathing yet again to ask, "Have I failed my Primus?" Alaron broke from his thoughts one last time as he looked down at the kneeling man, but Alaron didn't see Falco. Alaron didn't know this man, but he knew who he served. This kneeling man was the embodiment of Alaron's self, and the man that Falco used to serve. Alaron knew himself well, but he knew Montano even better, and Alaron wasn't looking at a Decanus called Falco. Alaron was looking at another wild card of the Legion. Alaron knew right there that he was right when he spared the man months earlier. Falco's story had yet to be told, but Alaron, just like the Interfector, had a duty to ensure this fellow wild card too would someday arrive at that place he was seeking. Alaron had stood on the edge of that place for a long time, and would continue to do so, even as he remembered soldiers like the Interfector, and soldiers like Montano who had leaped from that edge, plunging down, 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 into that abyss of endless glory. Yet still he knew it would take some time for this kneeling man to get there. Alaron wordlessly ordered Falco to meet his eyes, and just when he did, Alaron heard a voice whisper in his ear. The voice was a thought from words spoken into existence at some point in the recent past. The voice said, "Don't you ever forget me or fail Lord Caesar like I did, Alaron." Not knowing if these words were from someone he admired and respected wholeheartedly or someone he convinced himself he hated, Alaron knew that they were from someone who'd already leaped from the edge he would always stand. Remembering the man that Falco served under, and how that man did not get the end he wanted, he remembered the Interfector who suffered the same fate. At the same time, both men had leaped into Legion glory after standing on the edge of it for so long, and with his mind focused on everything else in the world, Alaron knew that one way or another. Caesar's ways weren't long for the world, and yet the Legion would remain. Alaron finally met the eyes of his fellow wildcard and said to him, "You, Falco, will carry the banner forward till the day you die, just like the Lord Interfector, and just like Montano. What that looks like, I trust you'll know when the front moves, but regardless of what happens in the outcome of this campaign, the bull will need men like you." And so, Alaron stood his ground on the very edge of glory, remembering all who'd leaped from it in the past, and all those who would in the future. Not knowing how close or far the hour was that he would leap as well, or knowing the truth about one man who hadn't yet made the jump. End of Act.